You know what always surprises people about ancient Egypt? Everyone thinks they know the story. Massive pyramids, fancy tombs, gods with animal heads. But what they completely miss is how the entire civilization was actually built around waiting for mud. Straight up mud. And not just any mud. I'm talking about a very specific kind that only appeared once a year when the Nile decided to completely drown everything these people had built. Imagine waking up one day and your entire world is underwater. Not a disaster, but actually the best possible news. The reality of living alongside the Nile was nothing like what you see in movies. Most people imagine ancient Egyptians just hanging out in temples or building pyramids, but their actual daily existence revolved around something much more intense, predicting and surviving a massive flood that would either bring life or total devastation. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, let's head back to ancient Egypt. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket. Because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So congratulations, you just woke up in ancient Egypt, your eyes flutter open to darkness, not the gentle darkness of your bedroom now with maybe a hint of streetlight through the blinds. No, this is the pure blackness of a world without electricity. The air is thick with heat, and as you take your first conscious breath, you notice something, a smell, earthy, rich, slightly pungent. It's the scent of wet soil and vegetation, of the Nile itself. You're lying on a reed mat, not a memory foam mattress. The ground beneath is packed earth, cool against your back. Through the small window high in the mud brick wall, you can see the faintest lightening of the sky. Dawn is approaching. Already sounds filter in, voices calling, the braying of donkeys, the distant splash of water. This isn't some grand palace in Thebes or a noble's villa. You're in a simple home in Elephantine, the island at Egypt's southern border where the first cataract creates a natural boundary. The building you're in is made entirely of mud brick with thick walls to keep out the scorching heat of the day. Your home sits higher on the island, safe from the water that will soon rise. You stretch and sit up. Your name is Meritaten, and today is perhaps the most important day of your young life. You're 16 years old, and this is the first year you'll assist the priests in measuring the Nile's inundation at the Nilometer, the ancient stone gauge that predicts Egypt's fortune for the coming year. The floor feels different under your bare feet, slightly damp. That's new. You pause, heart suddenly racing. Could it be? Has it begun already? A voice calls from outside. Meritaten, hurry, it's happening. That's your father, Amenemhat, chief priest of the Nilometer. You grab a simple white linen kilt and pull it on. No time for washing or eating. If what your father says is true, nothing else matters right now. You step outside into the pre-dawn light. The air hits you like a warm, wet blanket. Despite the early hour, it's already hot, the humidity so thick you can almost drink it. The narrow street between the mud brick buildings is alive with activity. People are moving with purpose, all headed in the same direction, toward the Nilometer. There you are, your father says, appearing at your side. His shaved head gleams with sweat despite the early hour. As a priest, he keeps himself meticulously clean, his body free of hair, his white linen robes spotless. It's starting earlier than we predicted. The waters are rising at the first cataract. You follow him through the winding streets. Other families are emerging from their homes, faces tense with anticipation. Children run ahead, excited by the commotion. This is the moment everyone has been waiting for, praying for. The Nilometer comes into view as you round a corner. It's not an impressive structure, simply a stone staircase leading down into a well connected to the Nile by a small channel, but what it represents is nothing less than life itself. A crowd has already gathered. You recognize the governor standing apart from the common people, his fine linen gleaming white in the growing light, his servants creating a bubble of space around him. The other priests are there too, preparing for the ceremony that will mark the beginning of Akhet, the season of inundation. You've heard about this moment your whole life. You've seen the Nilometer before, of course, but this is different. This is the first time you'll witness it in action, the first time you'll be part of the sacred measurement that will determine taxes, food supplies, and possibly survival for the entire kingdom. What most people don't understand about ancient Egypt is that the entire civilization, from the humblest farmer to the divine pharaoh himself, lived and died by the flood. Too little water meant famine, too much meant destruction. The difference between life and death came down to a few precise markings on stone. Your father leads you past the crowd to the Nilometer itself. Already you can see water seeping into the well, covering the first few steps of the staircase. The king's messenger will be watching, your father whispers, adjusting your kilt. Whatever number we report will be carried to Memphis, and from there to the palace. The Divine One himself will want to know immediately if we will have abundance or less. You swallow hard. The weight of responsibility settles on your shoulders like a stone block. This isn't just some religious ritual. The measurements taken here will determine the tax rate for the entire kingdom. If the Nile rises to 14 cubits, it will be a disaster. Barely enough water to irrigate the fields. If it reaches 16 cubits, the harvest will be abundant and taxes can be higher. The perfect height is 16 cubits. Exactly right, as the saying goes. But if the water reaches 18 cubits or higher, it will be catastrophic. Fields washed away, villages destroyed, lives lost. At 18 cubits, no taxes can be collected because there will be nothing to tax. The crowd falls silent as your father raises his arms. The season of Akhet has begun, he intones. Happy Lord of the fishes and birds of the marshes has arrived. We come to measure his blessing. You've been trained for years for this moment. With steady hands, you help prepare the measuring cord, marked with knots at precise intervals. Your father will lower it into the well, and together you'll read the height of the water. As the ceremony begins, you notice something odd. The water is rising faster than normal. Usually, the Nile rises gradually over days, but now you can actually see the water creeping up the steps minute by minute. Your father notices, too. His face doesn't change. He's too well trained for that. But you catch the flicker of concern in his eyes. He leans close and whispers, "Watch carefully, my son. This is not normal. The gods are sending us a message." The measuring begins. You hold one end of the cord while your father descends the steps until he's ankle deep in the rising water. The crowd watches in tense silence. Everything depends on this moment. Your father makes the measurement, then climbs back up. He gives the governor a slight nod, and relief visibly washes over the official's face. Your father turns to the crowd. 12 cubits already, with more to come. Happy brings a strong flood this year. Prepare your fields and your storehouses, for we will have abundance. A cheer rises from the crowd. 12 cubits this early in the season means the flood will likely reach the optimal 16. Not too little, not too much. Just right. But as the crowd disperses, your father pulls you aside, his face grave. "I told them what they needed to hear," he says quietly. "But the truth is more complicated. The water is rising too quickly. If it continues at this rate, we could see 18 cubits or more. Disaster." "And why didn't you tell them?" you ask. because panic helps no one, and because I could be wrong. The gods work in mysterious ways. Perhaps the rise will slow, perhaps not. We must watch and measure every day, and we must pray. He grips your shoulder. This is the true work of the Nilometer priest, meditating. Not just to measure, but to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Lives depend on our wisdom as much as our accuracy. As you walk back home, you see the community already preparing for the flood. Men are reinforcing the mud brick walls of their homes with extra clay. Women are moving food stores to higher ground. Children are helping wherever they can, carrying small items to safety. This, you realize, is the real Egypt. Not the massive monuments or the grand palaces, but ordinary people preparing for the annual miracle and potential disaster that is the Nile flood. Every aspect of life revolves around this cycle. The calendar itself is built around it. Akhet, the inundation, Pere, the growing season, and Shemu, the harvest. Back at home, your mother is preparing for the flood in her own way. She's mixing beer, thicker and more nutritious than what you might imagine beer to be. It's more like liquid bread, and it's a staple of the Egyptian diet. During the flood, when movement is restricted and fresh food might be hard to come by, stored beer and bread become even more important. "Did it go well?" she asks, not looking up from her work. "Father says the flood will be good this year," you reply, carefully following his lead. She nods, satisfied. "Then we'll have a good harvest and the taxes won't be too heavy. The gods are kind." You help her with the brewing, grinding grain with a stone mortar and pestle. The familiar motion is soothing after the tension of the morning. Through the doorway, you can see the Nile in the distance, flowing peacefully for now. But you know its nature is about to change dramatically. As the day progresses, more news arrives from upriver. The flood is indeed coming faster than usual. Messengers report that villages closer to the first cataract are already seeing water levels rising rapidly. Your father is called away for an emergency meeting with the governor. While he's gone, you climb to the roof of your home, the highest point you can easily reach. From here, you can see much of the island and the river surrounding it. The Nile looks different already, muddier, faster, higher against its banks. In the distance, you can see the first fields beginning to disappear under the advancing water. It's a strange sight, land slowly vanishing, becoming one with the river, and yet this apparent destruction is actually creation. Without this annual drowning, Egypt would be nothing but desert. The floodwaters carry rich black silt from the highlands of Ethiopia, depositing this fertile soil across the floodplain. When the waters recede, the land will be reborn, ready for planting. The flood transforms the landscape completely. During the height of Akhet, most of the floodplain will be underwater, turning Egypt into a series of islands connected by raised pathways. Villages built on higher ground become isolated from one another. Travel is difficult mostly by boat. Many crafts and industries shut down. Farmers, unable to work their submerged fields, are drafted for building projects or other labour. It's a time of both danger and celebration, of anxiety and faith. And this year, with the waters rising faster than normal, the tension is even higher. Your father returns at midday, his face drawn. "The governor is worried," he says to your mother. "The last time the waters rose this quickly was 15 years ago, when the flood reached 19 cubits and 3 settlements were washed away." 15 years ago, just after you were born. You've heard stories about that terrible flood, but you were too young to remember it. "What does this mean for us?" your mother asks, her hands stilling in her work. "We should be safe here on the island," your father says, "but many of the lowland fields and villages..." He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. For the next several days, you assist your father in taking measurements at the Nilometer. The water continues to rise faster than anyone can remember. By the 5th day, it's already reached 14 cubits. Fields all along the river are disappearing underwater. But strangely, life goes on. This is Egypt, after all. The flood comes every year, and people have adapted. Boats become the primary mode of transportation. Temporary markets spring up on high ground. Children play in the shallower parts of the floodwaters, splashing and laughing, despite the danger. One morning, you accompany your father to a meeting with the governor and other officials. The room is tense. Reports have come in from throughout the region, and they're not good. 2 villages near the Second Cataract have been completely flooded, one official reports. The people escaped, but their homes and most of their possessions are gone. The watermarks at the Temple of Khnum are already higher than they've been in 20 years, says another. What are we to tell Pharaoh? The governor asks, addressing your father directly. His tax collectors will be making their plans based on our reports. Your father takes a deep breath. Tell him the truth. The flood is unusually high. Taxes should be adjusted accordingly. Some regions will produce nothing this year. Others may have the best harvest in a generation if their irrigation systems survive to channel the receding waters properly. The governor nods grimly. And what of the people? There are already refugees arriving from flooded villages. They must be housed and fed, your father says firmly. It is the will of Happy. Those who are blessed with safety must share with those who are not. Next year, it could be us seeking shelter. You realize something important in that moment. The Nilometer isn't just a tool for measuring water. It's a measure of society itself, of how Egypt responds to crisis, of how people treat one another when the flood brings either abundance or disaster. As you leave the meeting, your father points to a massive stone structure in the distance, a granary where surplus grain is stored. See that? He says. It was built after the great flood of your birth year. The previous one was washed away. After the disaster, the divine Pharaoh decreed that new granaries should be built on higher ground throughout Egypt. Each district now maintains a reserve large enough to feed its people for 2 years, if necessary. 2 years, you ask, impressed? Yes, because sometimes the flood fails 2 years in a row. Without those reserves, everyone would starve. He looks at you seriously. This is why our work at the Nilometer is so important. Our measurements help determine how much grain must be stored, how much can be traded, how much must be distributed. As you return to the Nilometer for the evening measurement, you see a crowd gathered there again, but this time the mood is different, more solemn, anxious. Word has spread about the unusual flood. Your father pushes through the crowd, you following close behind. When you reach the stone staircase, you both stop short. The water has risen dramatically in just a few hours. It's now at 15 cubits and still rising fast. Your father's face is grim as he performs the measurement, confirming what you can both see. When he turns to the crowd, he doesn't bother to hide the truth. 15 cubits and rising, he announces. The flood is higher than expected. Those in low-lying homes should move to higher ground immediately. Those with boats should prepare to assist in evacuations if needed. Instead of panic, you see the crowd organize itself with practiced efficiency. This is not the first dangerous flood they've faced, and it won't be the last. Neighbors immediately begin making plans to help one another. The wealthy offer space in their larger homes on higher ground. Boat owners volunteer their vessels. You're struck by the realization that the Nile hasn't just shaped Egypt's agriculture and economy, it's shaped its people, created a society that knows how to come together in crisis. That night, the sound of the river keeps you awake. Even from your home high on the island, you can hear the rush of water growing louder as the flood continues to rise. The Nile is no longer the calm, life-giving presence you've known all your life. It's becoming something else, powerful, potentially destructive, a force of nature that demands respect. Your father sits up late, calculating and recalculating his predictions for the flood's peak. You sit with him, learning to interpret the patterns, the relationship between the early measurements and the eventual crest. "It's going to be close," he says finally. "If the rise slows tomorrow, we might stay under 18 cubits. If not..." He doesn't need to finish. You both know what it means if the flood exceeds 18 cubits, not just damaged fields and homes, but a fundamental threat to Egypt's food supply and stability. "Is there nothing we can do?" you ask. "We can pray," your father says, "and we can prepare, but the river will do what it will do." That is the first lesson every Egyptian learns. He looks at you thoughtfully. "There's something I want to show you tomorrow, something few people ever see." The next morning, before dawn, your father wakes you. "Come," he says simply. You follow him through the sleeping settlement past the Nilometer to a small, unassuming building set back from the river. It looks like a storage shed, but when your father opens the door, you see it's something quite different. The single room is filled with papyrus scrolls, hundreds of them, stored carefully in wooden boxes and clay jars. Your father lights a small oil lamp, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "This is the Nilometer archive," he says, his voice hushed with reverence. "Records of the Nile's rise and fall, going back more than 1,000 years. You stare in amazement. 1,000 years? He nods. Every measurement, every day of every flood, recorded by the priests who came before us. This is how we know what to expect, how we learn to read the river's patterns. He selects a scroll from one of the boxes and unrolls it carefully. The papyrus is yellowed with age, the hieroglyphics faded but still legible. This one records the Great Flood during the reign of Pharaoh Jer over 700 years ago. The water reached 20 cubits, the highest ever recorded. Half the settlements in Upper Egypt were destroyed. You scan the ancient writing, marveling at this connection to the distant past. Here are the actual marks made by a priest long dead, recording a disaster that happened centuries before your birth. "And this," your father says, selecting another scroll, "is what I was looking for. The flood of your birth year, 19 cubits at its peak." He unrolls the scroll, revealing columns of neat hieroglyphics. You can read most of it. "See here." He points to a specific passage. "The water rose quickly at first, just like now, but then it slowed during the middle third of Akhet. That's what saved us from complete disaster." He looks up at you, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Every flood is different, yet every flood is the same. The river rises, peaks, and falls. What matters is how quickly it happens and how high it goes." He rolls the scroll carefully and returns it to its box. "This is the true wisdom of Egypt, Meritaten. Not the grand temples or the pyramids, but this, the patient recording of the river's rhythms, year after year, generation after generation. This is how we survive." As you leave the archive, the eastern sky is beginning to lighten. Another day of the flood is beginning. What will it bring? Will the waters continue their rapid rise, or will they slow, sparing Egypt from disaster? In the growing light, you see boats moving across what were fields just days ago. Farmers have turned into fishermen, taking advantage of the flood to supplement their food supplies. Children swim in the shallower waters, laughing and playing. Life adapts. Egypt endures. Your father puts his hand on your shoulder as you both gaze out at the transformed landscape. "Remember this, Meritaten," he says quietly. "The Nile gives and the Nile takes away. Our job is not to control it, no one can do that, but to understand it, to measure it, to respect it, and to help others do the same." You nod, watching the sunlight spread across the floodwaters, turning them from black to gold. Whatever happens in the days to come, you'll face it as Egyptians have always faced the unpredictable Nile, with preparation, with community, and with faith that after every flood, no matter how destructive, the land will be reborn. The water continues to rise as the morning progresses. By midday, it's reached 16 cubits, the ideal height for a perfect harvest, but it shows no sign of stopping. The current grows stronger, carrying debris from upstream, branches, parts of wooden structures, even a small boat, capsized and empty. Your father sends you to help evacuate a family living in a low area of the island. Their home is already taking on water. You assist them in moving their few precious possessions, clay pots, cooking utensils, sleeping mats, to a relative's house on higher ground. The father of the family, a fisherman named Senbi, thanks you with a gift of dried fish. "For your help," he says simply. Despite losing his home, he shares what little he has. This too is Egypt, generosity even in crisis. When you return to the Nilometer in the evening, the water has risen to almost 17 cubits. The crowd is larger now, tense and watchful. Everyone knows that 18 cubits is the threshold between difficulty and disaster. Your father performs the measurement with the same careful precision he always shows, but you can see the strain in his face when he announces 16 cubits and 4 palms. A murmur runs through the crowd, so close to the danger point already, and the flood has just begun. That night, you can't sleep. The sound of the river fills your ears, and your mind is full of images from the day. The submerged fields, the evacuated homes, the faces of the people balancing between hope and fear. You slip out of your sleeping mat and climb to the roof of your home. In the moonlight, the floodwaters seem to glow with an inner light. The transformed landscape is both beautiful and terrifying. The eternal dance of land and water, destruction and creation continues as it has since before the first pharaoh ruled. Tomorrow, you'll measure the waters again. Tomorrow, you'll help those in need. Tomorrow, you'll continue learning the ancient wisdom of the Nilometer, the science of survival in a land ruled by the river's rhythms. For now, you watch the moonlight on the water and contemplate the delicate balance that is life in ancient Egypt, a civilization built on the predictable unpredictability of the Nile's annual flood. The village of Hut-Herib looked nothing like it did 3 months ago, where dusty paths and small mud brick homes once stood. Now there was a sprawling lake stretching to the horizon. Only the tops of the tallest date palms and the village itself, built carefully on a rise of land, remained above the floodwaters. Nebet stood at the edge of her family's home, watching a small boat navigate the transformed landscape. The annual flood had reached its peak, turning the world into a shimmering expanse of water that reflected the cloudless blue sky. Unlike the anxious days when the waters first began to rise, now there was a strange peace to the inundation. This was her favourite time of year, when the world changed completely, when the impossible happened right before her eyes. Her mother's voice called from inside the house. "Nebet, stop daydreaming and help me with this beer." With a last glance at the water, Nebet turned and ducked through the low doorway. Inside, the single-room home was cool compared to the blistering heat outside. The thick mud-brick walls kept the worst of the sun at bay, while the small high windows allowed some light but little direct heat. Her mother, T, was bent over a large ceramic pot, stirring a thick mixture with a wooden paddle. The unmistakable sour smell of fermenting grain filled the air. "Here," T said, handing Nebbet the paddle. "Keep stirring while I prepare the dates." Brewing beer was women's work, and at 12 years old, Nebbet was expected to help. Unlike the thin, bitter beer you might know, ancient Egyptian beer was thick, sweet, and nutritious, more like liquid bread than a modern beverage. It was a staple food, consumed by everyone, from toddlers to elders. "The dates will make it sweeter," her mother explained, though Nebbet already knew this. "We need to make this batch special." "For the Feast of Happy?" Nebbet asked, continuing to stir the thick mixture. T nodded, slicing dried dates with practiced efficiency. "The highest flood in 10 years deserves our best offering. The Lord of the River has blessed us." The flooding had indeed been exceptional this year. When the waters first began to rise, there had been fear that it might be too much, a destructive inundation that would wash away homes and drown the carefully built irrigation systems. But the waters had risen steadily to just below the danger point, then stabilized. Now, 2/3 of the way through Akhet, the flood season, the entire village gave thanks daily to Happy, god of the Nile flood, for his generosity. Outside, the sounds of children playing in the shallower water drifted through the doorway. Despite the dramatic transformation of their world, life went on. During the flood season, many normal activities were impossible. No farming could be done on the submerged fields. No extensive travel could happen on the now underwater roads. But other work continued, and new opportunities arose. Nebbet's father, Nakht, was making the most of the flood. As a fisherman, this was his busiest time. Fish were plentiful in the expanded waters, and he spent his days casting nets from his small papyrus boat. He'd return each evening with his catch, which Nebbet and her mother would clean, salt, and dry for storage or trade. The door covering rustled, and Nakht ducked inside, bringing with him the smell of fish and river water. His shoulders were deeply tanned from endless days in the sun, his hands calloused from working with nets and ropes. "A good day?" T asked, not looking up from her work. "Better than good," Nakht replied, grinning. He held up a large net bulging with silver-scaled fish. "The flood has brought more fish than I've seen in years. Even the temple priests were impressed with what I brought them." This was significant news. The temple took a portion of everyone's production, a tax to support the priests, officials, and ultimately the divine pharaoh himself. But this tax wasn't resented. It was seen as giving back to the gods who provided the flood, who in turn provided life itself. "Did they say anything about when the waters will begin to recede?" T asked, taking some of the fish and beginning to clean them with practiced movements. "The nilometer at the temple shows the water has stopped rising," Nakht said. "The priests say if the pattern follows previous years, we'll see the land begin to emerge in about 20 days. Nebbet looked up from her stirring. 20 days until we can see our fields again?" Her father nodded. "And then the real work begins." Unlike the farmers who had little to do during the flood, Nebbet knew her family would be busiest when the waters receded. As the flood withdrew, it would leave behind pools and channels teeming with trapped fish, easy harvesting that required all hands working quickly before the hot sun dried the pools. "But for now," Nakht said, sitting down on a reed mat, "we prepare for the Feast of Happy. The whole village will gather tomorrow to give thanks for the perfect flood." The feast was the highlight of Akhet, a celebration of the life-giving inundation. Everyone in the village would contribute what they could. Beer, bread, fish, vegetables from the few garden plots on high ground that remained cultivable during the flood. There would be music, dancing, and offerings to Happy. As the sun began to set, Nebet climbed with her parents to the flat roof of their home. Many families in the village did the same each evening, seeking the cooler air and the spectacular view. From this vantage point, they could see the entire transformed landscape, the vast expanse of water, dotted with the tops of palm trees and the islands that were once the highest points of the land. Small boats moved across the water, fishermen returning home or people visiting neighbours in nearby villages. In the distance, Nebet could make out the temple complex, built on the highest ground and now surrounded by water like a fortress. "Look there," her father said, pointing to the western horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold. "When the sun sets like that, so red, it means Happy is pleased with our offerings." "And will the harvest be good?" Nebet asked, though she knew the answer. It was a ritual question, part of the reassurance they all sought during this time of waiting. "The best in years," her father confirmed. "The silt will be thick and black, perfect for planting. If Osiris is also generous, we'll have grain enough to last 2 years." Osiris, god of vegetation, the afterlife, and the cycle of death and rebirth, was closely linked with Happy in the minds of the Egyptians. The flood itself was sometimes said to be the tears of Isis mourning her husband Osiris. The death and resurrection of Osiris paralleled the annual cycle of the Nile, the dry season when the land seemed dead, followed by the flood that brought rebirth and new growth. These were not abstract theological concepts to Nebet and her family. They were the practical reality of life in Egypt, where survival depended entirely on understanding and working with the river's cycles. As darkness fell, lamps were lit across the village, small clay dishes of animal fat with reed wicks that cast a warm, flickering light. From rooftop to rooftop, neighbours called greetings and shared news. Despite the isolation created by the flood, community remained strong. "Nacht, will you bring that big Niloch fish to the feast tomorrow?" called a voice from a nearby roof. "If my wife leaves me any to bring," Nacht called back, and laughter rippled across the darkening rooftops. These evening gatherings were a special feature of the flood season. During the rest of the year, everyone was too busy with fieldwork to socialise much after dark, but Akhet brought a different rhythm, fishing in the morning, preparing food and crafts during the hot afternoon, and community gathering in the evening. Eventually, as the stars emerged in full brilliance, not dimmed by any artificial light, families began to descend back into their homes for the night. Nebet lingered a moment longer, watching the moon rise over the flood waters, turning them to silver. Tomorrow would be the feast, but the day after would bring something she'd been looking forward to even more. Her turn to accompany her older brother, Amenemhat, to the distant market. During the flood, regular market days in the village square were impossible. Instead, floating markets were established at strategic points where boats from different villages could gather to trade. These markets were vital for exchanging not just goods, but news. In a world without rapid communication, the latest information about the flood levels upstream, political developments in the capital, or potential threats from desert nomads travelled by word of mouth from village to village. Inside their home, Nebet helped her mother prepare a simple dinner: bread baked earlier in the day, dried fish softened in broth, and a paste of ground fava beans. They ate sitting on reed mats, using pieces of bread to scoop up the food. There were no plates or utensils as we know them. After dinner, in the dim light of a single oil lamp, Nebet's father worked on repairing his fishing nets while her mother spun flax into thread using a simple drop spindle. Nebet practiced her weaving on a small loom, another skill all Egyptian girls were expected to master. "Tell us a story, father," Nebet asked, her fingers working the weft thread through the warp. Nacht was known in the village for his stories. Though he couldn't read or write, those skills were reserved for scribes and priests. He had a prodigious memory and a way with words that made his tales come alive. "What story would you like?" he asked, his hands continuing their practiced movements with the net. "Tell about the time before the Nilometer, when no one knew if the flood would be good or bad," Nebet requested. It was one of her favourites, though she suspected parts of it were more legend than history. Nacht smiled, a good choice for the eve of the Feast of Happy. He cleared his throat and began in the rhythmic voice he used for storytelling. "Long ago, before the first kings united the two lands, before the first stone was laid for any temple, the people of the Nile lived in fear each year as Akhet approached, for they had no Nilometer to measure the flood, no records of past years to guide them, no priests to interpret the signs." His voice dropped dramatically. Each year was a mystery. Would Happy bring life-giving water, or would he bring destruction? Would the fields be nourished by rich silt, or would they remain dry and barren? No one knew until the waters came. Nebet's hands stilled on her weaving as she listened, though she'd heard the story many times before. In those days there lived a wise woman named Nechbet in a village much like ours. She watched the river more carefully than anyone, noting how the water birds behaved before the flood, how the crocodiles moved their nests, how the very air smelled different as Akhet approached. Year after year, Nechbet observed and remembered. When she became very old, she called the people of her village together and told them what she had learned. "Watch for the bright star Sothis rising just before the sun. When you see it, the flood will come within 5 days. Watch the colour of the first flood waters. If they are very red, the flood will be high. If they are more brown, it will be lower." The people listened to Nechbet and found that her signs were true. They began to prepare for each flood according to the signs, building their homes higher when a great flood was coming, digging deeper irrigation channels when a low flood was expected. Word of Nechbet's wisdom spread up and down the river. Soon every village had watchers who studied the signs, and when the first kings united Egypt and the first temples were built, the priests created the Nilometers, stone stairs descending into the river marked with cubits and palms, to measure precisely what Nechbet had taught the people to observe. Nacht's voice returned to normal, and that is why, even today, we watch for the star Sothis and observe the colour of the first flood waters, just as our ancestors did in the time before the Nilometer. Nebet smiled. She loved how the story connected her to countless generations who had lived by the same river, observed the same cycles, and depended on the same flood. "Is the story true, Father?" she asked, knowing his answer but playing her part in the ritual. "All stories contain truth," he replied, as he always did. Whether Nechbet was one woman or the collected wisdom of many, the signs she taught are real. We still use them today, alongside the Nilometer. As the lamp burned low, the family prepared for sleep. There were no beds, as we would recognize them, simply reed mats rolled out on the packed earth floor. During the hottest nights, like tonight, many people chose to sleep on the roof instead, where the air was cooler. Nebet carried her sleeping mat up to the roof, spreading it out beneath the star-filled sky. All around the village, other families were doing the same. The air was still warm but much more comfortable than inside the house. As she lay looking up at the stars, Nebet thought about the feast tomorrow. She would wear her best linen dress, simple by our standards, but the finest her family could afford. There would be music played on flutes and drums, dancing, and so much food. The whole village would gather in the temple courtyard, the highest point of land, to give thanks to Happy for the perfect flood. The thought of the feast must have followed her into sleep because she dreamed of dancing to flute music, the waters of the Nile sparkling around her feet. In her dream, the river god himself rose from the waters, a blue-skinned figure with a pot-belly and pendulous bresses, crowned with papyrus plants, exactly as he was depicted in the temple paintings. "Happy blesses those who respect the river," the god said in her dream. "Remember this, little one." She woke at dawn to the sounds of the village coming to life, voices calling, birds singing, the splash of boats being launched for early morning fishing. Today was the Feast of Happy, and there was much to prepare. Her mother was already up, putting the finishing touches on the special beer they would contribute to the feast. The dates had given it a rich sweetness, and the aroma filled their small home. "Come, help me strain this," Tai called, and Nebet hurried to assist. Together they poured the thick liquid through a fine mesh cloth into large clay jars that would be carried to the temple. Meanwhile, her father had brought in his early morning catch, more fish that would be quickly cleaned and cooked for the feast. Nothing would be wasted, even the entrails would be used as fertilizer for the garden plots. "The whole village is preparing," Nacht reported as he handed over his catch. "I've never seen so many boats out this early. Everyone wants to contribute something special for the feast." By mid-morning, the preparations were complete. Nebet changed into her feast dress, a simple shift of white linen that her mother had woven and sewn. She wore a single strand of blue faience beads, her most treasured possession given to her by her grandmother before she joined Osiris in the afterlife. The family loaded their contributions, the jars of beer, baskets of cooked fish and fresh bread, into their small boat. Nacht poled them through the flooded village toward the temple complex, joining a procession of similarly laden boats. The Temple of Happy wasn't grand like the great temples in the cities. It was a simple structure of stone and mud brick, but it was the heart of village life, especially during the flood. Built on the highest ground, it remained completely dry even during the greatest inundations. As they approached, Nebet could hear the music already beginning, the haunting sound of reed flutes, the steady beat of drums made from pottery and stretched animal skin. The temple courtyard was filling with villagers in their best clothes, everyone bringing food and drink to share. The priests stood at the entrance, dressed in white linen with leopard skins draped over their shoulders, the traditional garb for important ceremonies. They greeted each family, accepting offerings with formal blessings. "May Happy continue to bless your nets," the head priest said to Nacht as he presented their contributions. "May Isis make your beer sweet, and may Osiris bring abundance when the waters recede." Inside the courtyard, long reed mats had been laid out for people to sit on. At the centre stood a statue of Happy, not large or made of precious materials, but carved with reverence from local stone and painted in bright colours. The god was depicted with blue skin, a round belly, and breasts, symbolising the fertility and abundance he brought. His head was crowned with papyrus plants, the symbol of Lower Egypt. The statue had been specially decorated for the feast. Garlands of flowers hung around his neck, and offering bowls filled with beer, bread, and fish were placed at his feet. The village headman stood to address the gathered community. Though not a priest, he was responsible for civil administration and worked closely with the temple authorities. "People of Hut-Herib," he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "we gather today to give thanks to mighty Happy, Lord of the Flood, for his perfect inundation. The Nilometer shows 17 cubits, abundance without destruction. When the waters recede, our fields will be rich with silt, ready for the greatest harvest in a decade." A cheer went up from the crowd. 17 cubits was indeed perfect, high enough to cover all the farmland with water and silt, but not so high as to threaten the village itself. Before we feast, let us give proper thanks, the headman continued, turning to the head priest, who stepped forward to lead the ritual. What followed was both religious ceremony and community celebration. The priest recited formal prayers, his words ancient and somewhat difficult even for native speakers to fully understand, like an English speaker trying to follow Shakespeare. But everyone knew the general meaning and when to respond with the traditional phrases. "Hail to you, happy, who emerges from the earth, who comes to nourish Egypt," the priest intoned. "We give thanks for your blessing," the villagers responded in unison. The priest poured a libation of beer before the statue, letting it flow onto the ground. "Drink, happy, that you may continue to feed us with your waters." Then came the offering of bread and fish, placed ceremonially before the statue while the priest recited more prayers. Finally, the formal part of the ceremony concluded and the feasting began. Servants of the temple distributed food and drink to everyone present. Social distinctions remained. The village elite sat closest to the statue, while ordinary farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople sat further away. But everyone shared in the abundance. Musicians played more lively tunes now, and some people began to dance. Children ran and played games in the open spaces of the courtyard. The atmosphere was one of genuine joy and thanksgiving. Nebbet sat with her family, enjoying the special feast foods, bread made with honey, fish prepared with rare spices, vegetables grown in the temple gardens that remained above water during the flood. Beer flowed freely, though it was nothing like modern alcohol. More nutritious than intoxicating, though still mildly fermented. As the feast progressed, she noticed a group of strangers being welcomed by the headman. They had arrived in a larger boat than any in the village, traders from downriver bringing news and goods from the larger world. These traders were a common sight during Akhet. With normal farming activities suspended, the flood season was the perfect time for commerce. Boats could travel directly across the floodplain, taking shortcuts impossible during the dry season when they were confined to the river proper and the canals. "They've come from Memphis," someone nearby whispered excitedly. Memphis, the ancient capital near modern Cairo, was a major city that most villagers would never see in their lifetime. News from such a place was precious. Nebbet watched as the traders presented gifts to the headmen and priests, luxury items from the city that would have been unaffordable for ordinary villagers. In return, they would be given hospitality and the opportunity to trade with the locals in the days following the feast. She couldn't wait to visit the floating market where these traders would set up tomorrow. Perhaps they had beads like hers, or even the precious black coal that wealthy women used to line their eyes. The receding floodwaters revealed a transformed landscape. What had been a vast lake just weeks before was now a patchwork of wet, glistening mud and lingering pools. The rich black silt left behind by the flood, Kemet, the black land which gave Egypt its name, covered everything in a layer of fertility. Parton Marut wiped sweat from his brow and straightened his aching back. Like thousands of other men across Egypt, he had been drafted for the most important work of late Akhet, repairing and rebuilding the irrigation canals before the waters disappeared completely. All around him, men laboured with wooden hoes and reed baskets, digging channels through the soft mud. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the damp ground into a steaming sauna. But despite the heat and the back-breaking work, there was an atmosphere of purpose and even camaraderie among the labourers. Everyone understood what was at stake. If they failed to properly channel the receding floodwaters, the miracle of the Nile's bounty would be wasted. "Put your back into it, farmer," called the overseer, a local official named Amenemope who carried a thin stick as a symbol of authority. "The water won't wait for lazy men." Patan Marut didn't bother to respond. At 42, he was older than most of the labourers and had been through enough floods to know the rhythm of this work. The overseer's bluster was just part of the process, like the heat and the mud and the aching muscles. He plunged his wooden hoe back into the mud, carving out another section of the canal that would direct water to his village's fields. This wasn't optional work. Every able-bodied man was required to serve in the corvée labour system for a certain number of days each year. It was their tax, their contribution to the community and ultimately to the divine pharaoh himself. During most of the year, Patan Marut was a farmer tending his fields of barley and flax, but during late Akhet he became a canal digger. His knowledge of the land, which areas drained quickly and which held water, where the soil was richest and where it was more sandy, made him valuable to the canal-building effort. "Water's coming," someone shouted from further up the canal. The men straightened and watched as a small surge of water flowed down the channel they'd been digging. This was the moment of truth. Would their work hold? Would the water follow the path they'd created? The muddy water flowed smoothly through the new section, picking up speed as it found the carefully calculated slope. A cheer went up from the workers. This branch of the canal system was working as designed. Amenemope nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Now we can move to the secondary channel. Bring your tools and follow me." The men gathered their simple implements and trudged after the overseer, leaving behind the now flowing canal. As they walked, Patan Marut found himself alongside Usa Haight, a younger man from a neighbouring village. "How many more days of service do you have?" Usa Haight asked, adjusting the wooden hoe on his shoulder. "3 more after today," Patan Marut replied. "And you?" 5. It's my first year with full service obligations." Usahet looked around at the vast project underway across the floodplain. "I never realized how much work goes into the canals." Patan Marut nodded. "Most don't until they serve their time. But without this..." He gestured to the complex network of channels being dug across the landscape. "None of us would eat." The canal system was the true marvel of Egyptian civilization, more impressive in its way than the temples and pyramids. Every year after the flood, this entire infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Thousands of kilometers of waterways, from major arteries that could float boats to tiny capillaries that delivered water to individual fields. Without this system, the floodwaters would simply drain back into the river, leaving most of the land dry within weeks. With it, farmers could control exactly how much water reached their fields and when, extending the growing season and maximizing yields. "Here," Amenemope said, stopping at an unmarked patch of mud that looked identical to the surrounding landscape. "The secondary channel begins here and runs to those palms in the distance." How did he know? There were no visible markers, no signs that a canal had ever existed here. But Patan Marut knew the answer. The overseer carried a papyrus scroll, the canal map for this district, created and maintained by scribes over generations. Every channel was recorded, its dimensions and direction precisely noted. The men set to work again, digging a new channel according to Amenemope's directions. The overseer paced back and forth, occasionally consulting his scroll and using a measuring cord to check the width and depth of the excavation. Canal building was an exact science. The slope had to be just right, too steep and the water would flow too fast, eroding the banks, too shallow and it would stagnate, creating breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects. The width and depth had to match the volume of water expected, and the entire system had to work together, with main channels feeding secondary ones, which in turn fed the smallest field ditches. By midday, the heat was almost unbearable. The workers were given a brief rest, gathering in what little shade could be found under a cluster of date palms. They drank water from clay jars and ate a simple meal of bread and onions. When I was a boy, Patan Marut said to Userhet and some of the other younger men, my father told me that in the old days they used to divert entire branches of the Nile to create new farmland. Is that possible? One young man asked, eyes wide. Patan Marut nodded. With enough men and the right knowledge, yes. The old kings did it. They turned desert into fields by changing the course of the river itself. Could we do that now? Userhet wondered. Perhaps, if the divine pharaoh commanded it. But our task is more modest, to make sure the water from this flood reaches all the existing fields before it's lost to the sea. After the brief rest, work resumed. The afternoon brought a new challenge, a section where the ground was less cooperative, more sandy than silty. Here the canal walls kept collapsing as soon as they were dug. Amenemope conferred with the older workers, including Patan Marut. We need to reinforce this section, the overseer decided. Bring palm fronds and mud bricks. This was a common solution for unstable sections. The palm fronds would be woven into mats and used to line the canal walls, then covered with a layer of mud bricks. It was more labour-intensive than simply digging through good soil, but necessary to ensure the canal would last through the growing season. As the sun began to descend toward the western horizon, Amenemope finally called an end to the day's work. The men were exhausted, covered in mud from head to toe. They gathered their tools and began the walk back to their villages. Despite his fatigue, Patan Marut felt a sense of satisfaction. The work was progressing well. If the weather held and no unexpected problems arose, they would complete this section of the canal system within the allotted time. As they walked, the landscape around them was a hive of similar activity. In every direction, teams of men were digging channels, reinforcing banks and constructing small dams to control the flow of water. It was a massive, coordinated effort involving tens of thousands of workers across Egypt. Look there, Patan Marut said to Userhet, pointing to a distant group working on a much larger canal. Those are the Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers were an elite corps of specialists who designed and supervised the most important waterworks, the main canals that fed entire districts, the levees that protected cities, and the reservoirs that stored water for the dry months. Unlike the local corvée labourers, they worked year-round and were paid from the royal treasury. How does one become a royal engineer? Userhet asked, watching the distant figures with interest. First, you must become a scribe, Patan Marut replied. Years of study, learning to read and write, to calculate and measure. Then, if you show talent, you might be selected for training in water management. It's a path for those with connections or exceptional ability. Userhet nodded thoughtfully. My sister's son has been chosen for scribe training. Perhaps one day. It's a good path, Patan Marut agreed. Scribes don't break their backs digging canals. They parted ways at a fork in the path, each heading to his own village. By the time Patan Marut reached home, the sun was setting, painting the landscape in gold and crimson. His village, unlike the one we saw during the height of the flood, was built on somewhat lower ground. During the inundation, the people had relocated to temporary shelters on higher land. Now, with the floodwaters receding, they had returned to their permanent homes and were busy repairing any damage caused by the long submersion. Mud brick houses, after weeks underwater, needed extensive work. Walls had to be patched, floors resurfaced, and everything thoroughly dried to prevent mould. The entire village smelled of damp earth and the dung fires used to speed the drying process. Patan Merut's wife, Henut Mehit, had a hot meal waiting for him. A thick stew of lentils with bits of salted fish and fresh bread baked in a clay oven. After washing off the worst of the mud in a basin of water, he sat on a reed mat to eat. "How goes the canal work?" Henut Mahit asked, serving him a cup of beer to wash down the food. "Well enough," he replied between hungry bites. 3 more days should see the secondary channels completed. Then it's back to our own fields." Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, joined them for the meal. The boys, at 16 and 14, were already working with the men on the canal project. The girl, just 9, helped her mother with household tasks and tending their small garden plot, which had remained viable throughout the flood thanks to its raised position. "Naktank learned something interesting from the Royal Engineers today," the older son said, referring to his younger brother. "Oh?" Patan Merut looked at his younger son with interest. The boy nodded eagerly. "They use a tool called a merket to make sure the canals are level. It's like a plumb line, but they use it with water to find the true level." Patan Merut smiled. His younger son had always been fascinated by tools and how things worked. The Royal Engineers have many such tools. That's why they can build canals that last for years, not just a single season. After the meal, despite his exhaustion, Patan Merut took a walk through the village. As a respected elder, he had responsibilities beyond his own household. He checked on an elderly neighbour whose son was away serving in the army, made sure a recent widow had help repairing her roof, and stopped to discuss the canal progress with the village headman. The headman, a stout man named Mahu, who served as the link between the village and the district officials, was concerned. "The overseer says we're behind schedule," he told Patan Merut. "If the channels aren't ready when the last flood waters recede, we'll lose precious growing time." "We've faced worse," Patan Merut reassured him. "Remember the year of the Great Flood when half the dikes washed away? We still managed to plant before Pare was half over." Peret, the growing season, followed Akhet in the Egyptian calendar. It was the time when crops were sown and tended, lasting roughly from November to February. After Peret came Shemu, the harvest season, from March to June. Then the cycle would begin again with the next flood. "True," Mahu acknowledged. "But the district governor is pressing for faster progress. He has quotas to meet, grain projections to fulfill." "We'll manage," Patan Merut said with the confidence of long experience. "The young men are strong, if inexperienced. With proper guidance, they'll learn quickly." This was another of his unofficial roles, reassuring the headman who bore the weight of responsibility for the village's productivity. If the harvest failed to meet the expected yield, it was Mahu who would face the district governor's displeasure. By the time Patan Merut returned home, night had fallen completely. Inside his house, a small oil lamp provided the only light, a simple clay dish filled with animal fat with a reed wick. His family was preparing for sleep, spreading reed mats on the packed earth floor. There was no privacy, as we would understand it. The entire family slept in the same room, parents and children together. This was normal in Egyptian village homes, which typically consisted of just 1 or 2 rooms plus a small courtyard. Despite his exhaustion, Marut found it hard to fall asleep. His back ached from the day's labour, and his mind was busy with calculations and concerns. How much seed would they need for planting? Would the barley field, which had yielded poorly last year, do better with the rich new silt? Should they plant more flax this year, given the high prices textile merchants had been paying? These were the thoughts that occupied a farmer's mind during late Akhet, planning for the growing season to come, making decisions that would determine his family's prosperity for the entire year. Beside him, Henut Mahit stirred. "You're not sleeping," she observed quietly. "Too many thoughts," he admitted. "About the canals?" "About everything. The canals, the planting, the children." He sighed. Nakt Ankh is showing interest in the engineer's work. Perhaps he could train as a scribe. Henut Mahit was silent for a moment. That would be a better life for him. Easier on the body, if not the mind. Marut nodded in the darkness. Every parent hoped their children might rise to a higher station, escape the endless cycle of physical labour that defined a farmer's existence. But scribe training was expensive and required connections. It would mean sacrifices for the whole family. "We'll see," he said finally. "For now, we focus on this season, one flood at a time, as my father used to say." He felt his wife's hand find his in the darkness, a small gesture of solidarity and comfort. Together they had weathered many floods, many plantings, many harvests. Whatever challenges this year brought, they would face them as they always had. The next morning came too soon, the first light of dawn filtering through the small windows high in the walls. Already the village was stirring, voices calling, chickens clucking, the smell of bread baking in communal ovens. Another day of canal work awaited, but first came morning rituals. Marut washed in a basin of precious clean water. Water was used sparingly for bathing, with most of it reserved for drinking and cooking. He ate a quick breakfast of bread dipped in bean paste, then gathered his tools. His sons joined him, and together they walked to the meeting point where the labour crews were assembled each morning. The overseer, Amanamope, was already there, papyrus scroll in hand, calling out assignments. "North section crew, continue the secondary channel from yesterday," he ordered. "South section, begin the field channels for the barley lands. East section, reinforce the main canal bank where it's showing weakness." Marut and his sons were assigned to the east section, along with Uzahet and several other men from neighbouring villages. The main canal was the most critical part of the system. If it failed, all the secondary channels would be useless. They walked to their assigned section, where the problem was immediately apparent. A section of the canal bank was slumping, the mud sliding back into the channel. If it continued, it could block the water flow or even cause a breach that would flood areas not meant to receive water yet. "We need to rebuild this section completely," said the crew leader, an experienced canal worker named Paheri. "Remove all the soft mud, then rebuild with alternating layers of stiff clay and plant fibre." This was more complex work than simple digging. It required knowledge of materials and construction techniques. Marut, with his years of experience, was put in charge of a small team, including his sons and Uzahet. "First, we scrape away all this loose material," he instructed. "Get down to firm soil, then we'll lay the reinforcement." The younger men set to work with enthusiasm, if not always with skill. Marut corrected them gently, showing them how to test the firmness of the soil, how to shape the bank at the proper angle. "Not so steep," he told his younger son, who was forming the new bank. "If it's too steep, it will just slump again when it gets wet. A gentle slope is stronger." As the morning progressed, their section of rebuilt bank took shape. plant fibers, mainly straw and palm fronds, were layered with clay to create a strong, flexible structure that could withstand the pressure of water. This was ancient technology used since the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, but still effective. Around midday, an unexpected visitor arrived at the work site, a scribe, identifiable by his clean white kilt and the writing kit he carried, a wooden palette with depressions for black and red ink, and reed pens tucked behind his ear. He was accompanied by 2 soldiers, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the sunlight. The workers straightened, wiping sweat from their faces. A visit from a royal scribe was unusual and potentially concerning. Was there a problem with their work? Had someone complained to the district officials? Amenemope hurried over to greet the scribe, bowing respectfully. They spoke in low voices, with the overseer gesturing toward the canal works in progress. Then, to everyone's surprise, Amenemope turned and pointed directly at Parton Merut. "You there, Parton Merut, come here," the overseer called. With a confused glance at his sons, Parton Merut set down his tools and approached the officials. He bowed to the scribe, keeping his eyes lowered as was proper when addressing a superior. "This is the man I mentioned," Amenemope said to the scribe. "He has worked on the canals for over 30 years and knows this district's water system better than anyone." The scribe looked Parton Merut over with an appraising eye. "You understand canal construction?" he asked. "I know what works and what doesn't in our soil, honoured one," Parton Merut replied cautiously. "I've seen many floods come and go." The scribe nodded. "Good. The Royal Engineers are facing a challenge with the new reservoir project north of here. The soil is similar to your district. They need experienced men to advise on local conditions." Parton Merut's heart skipped. The Royal Engineers? The Reservoir Project? This was far beyond his usual corvée service. "The district governor has authorized me to recruit 10 men with suitable knowledge," the scribe continued. "You have been recommended. You will be compensated for your time beyond your corvée obligation, of course." It was both an honour and a concern. Working with the Royal Engineers would mean leaving his village, perhaps for weeks. His own fields would need attention soon, but the compensation might make a significant difference to his family's prosperity, and the knowledge he might gain from working alongside the kingdom's best water engineers could benefit his entire community. "I am honoured to serve the divine pharaoh in any capacity," Parton Merut said, the formal response expected of any loyal subject. The scribe made a note on his papyrus. "Good. Report to the reservoir site at dawn tomorrow. Bring any tools you consider useful." With that, the scribe and his escorts departed, leaving Parton Merut standing in stunned silence. Around him, the other workers murmured in surprise and speculation. "The Reservoir Project," User Het said, eyes wide with amazement. "They say it will hold water for a full season after the flood recedes. Nothing like it has been built in generations." Parton Merut nodded slowly, still processing this unexpected turn of events. The reservoir was the talk of the district, a massive engineering project ordered by the divine pharaoh himself to increase agricultural production by extending the growing season. If successful, it would change life dramatically for every farmer in the region, and now, somehow, he would be part of it. The fields of Heka-Nasut had transformed yet again. What had been a vast lake during Akhet, then a mud-covered plain during canal building, was now a patchwork of carefully prepared plots, dark with rich Nile silt waiting for seed. The end of Akhet and the beginning of Pere marked the most hopeful time in the Egyptian calendar. Planting season. After the flood's destruction and renewal came the promise of new growth, the continuation of life's eternal cycle. Kensit stood at the edge of her family's main field, her bare toes curling into soil still damp from the receded floodwaters. At 35, she had seen this transformation many times, yet it never failed to fill her with quiet wonder. The Nile's gift, this black fertile earth, was what made everything possible. "Are you going to stand there all day, or help with the ploughing?" called her husband, Senbi, from where he struggled with their wooden plough and reluctant ox. Kensit smiled and walked toward him. Unlike wealthier farmers who owned several oxen, they had just this one aging animal purchased after years of saving. Before that, they had pulled the plough themselves, back-breaking work that made even working with this stubborn beast seem like a blessing. "He's not happy today," Senbi grunted, trying to keep the plough's wooden blade cutting a straight furrow through the soil. Kensit moved to the ox's head, stroking its nose and speaking in soothing tones. "Come, old one, just a few more hours and you can rest." The animal seemed to respond to her touch, pulling more steadily as Senbi guided the plough. This was their rhythm, developed over 15 years of marriage and farming together. He had the strength to handle the plough. She had the patience to manage the animals and children. Their field wasn't large, about 1.5 aroras, the standard Egyptian unit of land measurement, roughly equivalent to 1 acre, but it was their own, inherited from Senbi's father, and with good management it produced enough to feed their family with a small surplus to trade for necessities they couldn't produce themselves. From across the field came the sound of children's voices. Their 3 youngest, 2 boys and a girl, were supposed to be clearing the last debris left by the flood from the field edges, but from the laughter and splashing, Kensit suspected they had found a puddle to play in instead. Their oldest son, Amenemhat, wasn't with the younger children. At 16, he was considered a man with adult responsibilities. He had been sent to the village seed storage to collect their planting grain, barley and emmer wheat that had been carefully preserved from the previous year's harvest. The seeds were precious. Each spring, the best portion of the harvest was set aside for the next year's planting. The village maintained a communal seed storage, a mud brick structure with thick walls and a raised floor that kept the grain dry and safe from rodents. Each family seed allocation was recorded by the village scribe and distributed when the fields were ready for planting. As they worked their way across the field, Kensit occasionally straightened to ease her back, looking around at the bustling activity across the floodplain. Every family was engaged in the same urgent work, preparing fields while the soil remained at the perfect consistency for planting. Too wet and the seeds might rot, too dry and the soil would be too hard to work effectively. "Look," she said to Senbi, pointing to a neighbouring field where a wealthier farmer directed several servants operating 2 ploughs. "Ipua has new ploughs with bronze tips." Senbi glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. "Bronze ploughs are for those who have more silver than sense. Wood works well enough if you keep it sharp." His tone was light, but Kensit knew the reality behind his words. Bronze tools were far beyond their means. Like most farmers, they made do with implements of wood, stone, and occasionally copper for smaller tools. The wooden plough Senbi used was the same basic design Egyptian farmers had been using for thousands of years, a simple share attached to poles that controlled its depth and direction. Despite its simplicity, the plough was effective, turning the rich soil to prepare it for seed. The flood had done most of the hard work already, softening the earth and depositing a fresh layer of fertile silt. Unlike farmers in other lands who had to add manure or other fertilizers to their fields, Egyptians received a free application of nature's best fertilizer every year, courtesy of the Nile. "Mother, father, look who's coming." Their youngest daughter, Nefertari, came running across the field, her dark eyes wide with excitement. Following more sedately behind her was Amenemhat, carrying a large basket on his shoulder. Beside him walked an unexpected figure, Patan Marut, the respected elder who had been recruited to work with the Royal Engineers on the reservoir project. Senbi stopped the plough, giving the ox a moment's rest as the visitors approached. Kensit brushed soil from her hands and straightened her simple linen dress. Patan Marut honours our field, Senbi said, inclining his head respectfully to the elder. What brings you to our humble plot when the Royal Engineers surely need your wisdom? The older man smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. The reservoir work proceeds, but I was given 2 days to attend to my own affairs. I saw your son at the seed storage and thought I would walk with him. It's been too long since I inspected the fields in this part of our district. This was a polite fiction. Everyone knew that Patan Marut was making rounds of the village farms, sharing what he had learned from the Royal Engineers. His knowledge was a gift to the community, more valuable than any physical object he could have brought. Amenemhat set down his basket, revealing the golden-brown grain inside, their planting seed for this season. Kensit felt the familiar mix of hope and anxiety that came with every planting. Those small, hard kernels represented their future. If they sprouted and grew well, the family would eat. If not, she pushed the thought away. The engineers have shown me a new method for preparing seed, Patan Marut said, kneeling beside the basket. They soak it in river water mixed with natron for 1 night before planting. They claim it makes the seed sprout more quickly and deters pests. Natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt collected from dried lake beds, was used for everything from preserving mummies to cleaning teeth. That it might help crops was a new idea, at least to the farmers of Hekkenasut. "Does it work?" Senbi asked, practical as always. "The royal fields show promising results," Patan Marut replied. "I've brought a small amount of natron to share." He produced a linen pouch from his belt. "Enough for your seed, if you wish to try." This was a generous gift. While not rare, natron had to be traded for, and Patan Marut was sharing knowledge and materials he could have kept for his own fields. "We are grateful," Kensit said, accepting the pouch. She looked at her eldest son. "Amenemhat, find a clean pot for soaking the seed tonight." The boy nodded and hurried off toward their home, a simple mud brick structure visible in the distance, where the cultivated fields met the slightly higher ground of the village proper. Patan Marut stayed for a while, discussing the canal system and water distribution with Senbi. The 2 men walked the boundaries of the field, examining the small irrigation channels that would bring water from the larger canals to this specific plot. "The new reservoir will change how we irrigate," Patan Marut explained. "Instead of depending entirely on the flood, we'll have water available later into the growing season." "And who will control this water?" Senbi asked, the question that concerned every farmer. "The same officials who oversee the canals," Patan Marut replied, "but with more consistent water throughout the year, there will be less competition for it during critical times." Kensit listened while continuing to work. The politics of water didn't interest her as much as the practical reality of getting their crops planted on time. She called her younger children over to help prepare the remaining section of the field, showing them how to break up clods of earth with wooden hoes. Eventually, Patan Marut took his leave, moving on to the next farm to share his knowledge. Senbi returned to the plough, and the family fell into the rhythm of their work, the steady pace of the ox and plough, the children clearing debris, Kensit smoothing the ploughed soil with a wooden rake. By midday, the sun was high and hot. The brief respite of cooler temperatures that came with the flood was over. Egypt's relentless heat had returned. The family retreated to a small shelter at the field's edge, just a simple roof of palm fronds supported by 4 poles, to eat a midday meal and rest during the worst of the heat. Amenemhat had returned from the house with food. Bread, dried fish, and a few onions, and a clay jar of water. They ate in companionable silence, hungry from the morning's work. "Tomorrow we plant?" asked one of the younger boys, Jehuti, who at 8 years old was still learning the agricultural cycle. "Tomorrow we plant the barley," Senbi confirmed. "The wheat will wait 2 more days." Staggering the planting was a common strategy, spreading both the work and the risk. If disease or pests struck, or if an unexpected dry spell came, it was better not to have all crops at the same vulnerable stage. After their brief rest, work resumed. The afternoon was devoted to final preparations, checking the irrigation channels, clearing the last debris, and setting up boundary markers. Stone markers engraved with the family's name defined the edges of their field, an important precaution in a land where the annual flood could erase visible boundaries. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Senbi finally called an end to the day's work. The family gathered their tools, the plough, hose, and rake, and began the walk back to their home in the village. Kensit watched as her husband ran a practiced hand over the wooden plough, checking for any damage or wear that would need to be repaired before tomorrow. The implement was simple but essential, a curved piece of acacia wood tipped with a slightly harder wood, with handles extending up and back for the ploughman to guide it. No metal, no complex mechanics, yet it had served Egyptian farmers effectively for thousands of years. Their home, like most in the village, was a simple rectangular structure of mud brick with a flat roof. It consisted of a main room where the family cooked, ate, and slept, plus a small storage area and a courtyard where much of daily life took place. Compared to our modern homes, it would seem tiny and sparse, but by the standards of Egyptian peasant farmers, it was entirely adequate. In the courtyard, preparations for the next day's planting were already underway. Following Parton Marut's advice, Amenemhat had set up a large pottery vessel filled with Nile water. Under Kensit's direction, he carefully added some of the natron, stirring until it dissolved. "Now, the seed," she instructed, and together they poured in the barley from the basket, making sure all the grain was submerged. "How does it work?" Amenemhat asked, curious as always about the reasons behind things. Kensit shrugged slightly. Parton Marut says it makes the seed sprout faster. Perhaps the natron wakes up the sleeping plant inside each grain. This wasn't far from the truth, though expressed in terms a Bronze Age farmer would understand. The natron, a mix of sodium compounds, could indeed help soften the seed coat and deter some pests and fungi. Inside their home, Senbi's youngest daughter was grinding grain for the evening meal, using a saddle quern, a concave stone base, and a smaller stone for grinding. It was slow, hard work, but essential. Every family ground their own grain daily. Bread was the foundation of every meal. The house had no kitchen as we would recognize it. Cooking was done in the courtyard over an open fire, or, for bread, in a small mud brick oven. The main room held few furnishings, some reed mats for sitting and sleeping, a few wooden stools, clay storage jars, and baskets for clothing and personal items. Yet, despite this material simplicity, the home felt alive with purpose and family bonds. The children chatted about their day as they helped with evening tasks. Senbi discussed planting strategies with his eldest son, passing on knowledge that had come down through generations. Kensit directed it all with the quiet authority of a mother who knew exactly what needed to be done and when. As darkness fell, the family gathered for their evening meal. Fresh bread, a stew of lentils with a few precious bits of dried fish, and beer. The beer, like most Egyptian beer, was nutritious and only mildly alcoholic, more of a liquid food than an intoxicant. Even the children drank it, though watered down. After the meal came the final preparations for the next day's planting. Seeds had to be ready, tools gathered, water jars filled. Nothing could be left to chance when it came to the critical task of getting seed into the ground at the optimal time. But first, there was one more important ritual. Senbi brought out a small wooden figurine from its special place in a niche in the wall. It represented Osiris, god of vegetation and rebirth, his green-painted skin symbolizing the sprouting crops. The family gathered around as Senbi placed the figurine on a small mat. Before it, he set a tiny portion of bread and a few drops of beer, offerings to ensure the god's blessing on their planting. "Great Osiris," Senbi intoned, "who dies and is reborn like the crops in our fields. Bless our seed that it may sprout and grow strong. As you returned from death, let our barley rise from the dark earth into the light." It was a simple prayer, without the elaborate rituals and formulations of temple worship, but it connected this humble family directly to the cosmic forces they believed governed the natural world. In Egyptian thought, there was no firm line between the religious and the practical. The success of their crops depended both on proper farming techniques and on divine favour. After the brief ceremony, the figurine was carefully returned to its niche. The day's final tasks were completed and the family prepared for sleep. Like most Egyptians, they went to bed shortly after sunset and would rise with the dawn. Oil for lamps was expensive, and there was little reason to stay up in the darkness. Their sleeping arrangements were simple. Reed mats were unrolled on the packed earth floor, with linen sheets for covering in the cooler months or just for comfort in the warmer seasons. There were no separate bedrooms. The entire family slept in the main room, parents and children together. As they settled onto their mats, Jehuti, the 8-year-old, asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Father, why do we plant some seeds and eat others? They look the same." Senbi smiled in the darkness. It was a good question, showing the boy was thinking about the world around him. "The seeds we plant are chosen carefully," he explained. "They come from the strongest plants, the ones that grew best and produced the most grain. We save them specially for planting, so our new crops will be strong too." "But they still look the same as the ones we eat," the boy persisted. "To our eyes, yes," Senbi agreed, "but the gods can see the difference. They see the strength hiding inside each seed, waiting to grow." This seemed to satisfy the child, who fell silent. Soon, the rhythmic breathing of sleeping children filled the small room. Kensit, however, remained awake a while longer, her mind full of the next day's tasks. Planting required precision and care. The seeds had to be distributed evenly, not too densely packed nor too sparse. They had to be pressed into the soil at just the right depth, deep enough to stay moist and protected, but not so deep that the sprouts couldn't reach the sunlight. In her mind, she walked through each step of the process, making sure nothing had been forgotten. This mental preparation was as important as the physical work itself. In a society without written checklists or manuals, memory and careful planning were essential skills. Beside her, Senbi was already asleep, storing up energy for tomorrow's labour. She smiled in the darkness, grateful for his steady presence, his knowledge of farming, his dedication to their family. Together, they had weathered floods both excessive and insufficient, harvests both abundant and meagre. Whatever this year brought, they would face it as they always had, with hard work, practical wisdom, and faith in the eternal cycle. Dawn came early. as it always did. The first light filtering through the small windows high in the walls roused the family. There was no lingering in bed. Planting day waited for no one. A quick breakfast of leftover bread dipped in a paste of ground fava beans provided fuel for the morning's work. Then it was time to check the soaked seeds. Kensit and Amenemhat carefully drained the water from the pottery vessel, examining the barley seeds. They had swollen slightly with the absorbed moisture, a good sign. "They look eager to grow," Kensit said with satisfaction. She divided the seeds into baskets, one for herself, one for Senbi, and smaller ones for the older children. Even the youngest would help with planting. Every pair of hands was needed. The tools for planting were simple. Each person carried a small bag of seed tied at the waist and a wooden hoe. The adults also had a board attached to a long handle, a simple tool for pressing the seeds into the soil at a consistent depth. The family walked together to their field as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. They were not alone. Across the floodplain, other families were engaged in the same timeless activity. The entire landscape hummed with purposeful energy as Egypt's farmers began the cycle of growth that would sustain the kingdom for another year. At the field's edge, Senbi paused for a brief prayer, asking once more for Osiris's blessing on their work. Then, without further ceremony, they began. The method was ancient and effective. The adults and older children moved across the field in a line, each responsible for a section of equal width. They walked backward, scattering seed from their bags with practiced sweeps of the hand. The youngest children followed, using small hoes to cover the seeds with soil. No one spoke much. They needed no instruction. This was knowledge absorbed through observation and practice, year after year, generation after generation. Even the children knew their roles and performed them with surprising skill. Kensit found herself falling into an almost meditative state as she worked. The rhythmic motion of scattering seed, the feel of the grains against her fingers, the smell of the damp earth, all connected her to countless women who had done exactly this, in exactly this way, for thousands of years. In that moment, time seemed to fold in upon itself. She was not just Kensit, wife of Senbi, mother of 4. She was every Egyptian farm woman who had ever cast seed upon the black land left by the Nile's gift, and those who would come after her, her daughter, her future granddaughters, would join this unbroken chain, continuing the eternal cycle of flood, planting, and harvest that defined life in the shadow of the Nile. The village of Unu basked in the golden light of late afternoon. On a small rise overlooking the fields that stretched toward the horizon, an old man sat on a woven reed mat, his back resting against the warm stones of a shrine dedicated to the Nile god Hapi. Ipuwer was the village's eldest member, his face a map of wrinkles etched by 90 years of sun and wind and laughter. Children gathered around him, sitting cross-legged on the ground, their eyes wide with anticipation. It was a time-honoured tradition. In the quieter days after planting, when the first tender shoots of barley and wheat were beginning to transform the black earth to green, the old man would share the wisdom of ages. "Tell us about the Great Flood," a small boy urged, bouncing slightly with excitement. "The one that came when you were young." Ipuwer smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Which one? I have seen 82 floods in my lifetime, each one different, each one the same." "The biggest one," a girl suggested. "The one that reached all the way to the temple steps." "Ah," the old man nodded slowly. "The flood of the 12th year of Pharaoh Amenhotep, may he live forever. I was just 8 years old, about your age, little Nefertari." He settled more comfortably against the stones, gathering his thoughts. The children waited patiently. There was no hurry here, no rush to move on to the next activity or entertainment. Stories were treasured, and a good storyteller even more so. It began like any other flood, Ipua said, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of practiced storytelling. The star Sothis appeared just before dawn, announcing that Akhet would soon begin. The priests at the Nilometer watched for the first signs of rising water. But when it came faster than anyone expected. His gnarled hands rose and fell, mimicking the water's movements. Within days, the river had burst its banks. Water covered the fields and kept rising. Boats had to navigate by the tops of palm trees. Families moved to higher ground, bringing their animals and whatever possessions they could carry. The children listened, spellbound. Though none had experienced such a devastating flood in their lifetimes, the last truly excessive inundation had been decades ago. They understood the precarious balance their lives depended on. Too little water meant famine, too much meant destruction. My father was a canal engineer, Ipua continued, and he was called to help strengthen the levees protecting the temple granaries. I went with him, carrying his tools. I remember standing on the highest point of the village, watching the water stretch from horizon to horizon. It looked like the primeval waters of Nu, from which the world first emerged in the time of the gods. A boy of about 10 raised his hand. "Were you afraid?" "Yes," Ipua admitted. "We all were, but fear is the shadow of wisdom. It teaches us respect for forces greater than ourselves." He paused, letting the children absorb this concept. "And we were right to fear. When the water finally receded 2 months later than usual, many homes had been washed away. Fields were covered with sand instead of silt in some places. It took 3 years for the land to fully recover." "But it did recover," said the oldest girl in the group, about 14, her voice seeking reassurance. "Always," Ipua nodded firmly. "That is the miracle of Egypt. The land dies and is reborn, just as Osiris died and was reborn. This is the gift of the Nile, not just water and soil, but renewal." He looked out over the fields below, where green shoots were beginning to transform the landscape. This was Pere, the growing season, when the planted seeds emerged and reached for the sun. After Pere would come Shemu, the harvest time, when the mature grain would be cut, threshed, and stored. Then Akhet would return, the flood bringing death and rebirth to the land once more. "The cycle never ends," Ipua said softly, almost to himself, "and we are part of it, like the fish in the river or the birds in the sky." A smaller child, perhaps 5 years old, crawled into the old man's lap without hesitation. Ipua welcomed him with a gentle arm around his shoulders. "Tell about the Nilometer," the boy requested, snuggling against the elder's chest. Ipua smiled. The Nilometer was a favourite topic, a bit of human ingenuity that helped make sense of the Nile's mysterious ways. "The first Nilometer," he began, "was built in the time of the God Kings, before the two lands were united under the double crown. It was a simple thing, just a staircase leading down into the river, with marks on the wall showing the height of the water." "Like the one at the temple?" a child asked. "Yes, much like that one, though not as finely made. Over time, the design improved. Some Nilometers became wells connected to the river by underground channels. Others were columns standing in the water, marked with cubits and palms for measuring." He held up his hand, showing the width of his palm. 1 cubit is 6 palms from here to here on a man's arm. He indicated the distance from elbow to fingertips. "The perfect flood is 16 cubits, less than 12, and famine threatens. More than 18, and destruction comes." "How do the priests know what the flood will be?" another child asked. "Do they have magic?" Ipua chuckled. Some would say so, but their magic is knowledge passed down through generations. They watch for signs, how early the water begins to rise, how quickly it increases, the colour of the first floodwaters. They keep records on papyrus scrolls comparing each year's flood to those that came before. My father says the Royal Engineers are building a new kind of nilometer, an older boy mentioned, one that can predict the flood height long before it reaches our district. Yes, Ipua nodded. At Elephantine, near the first cataract, water arrives there 20 days before it reaches us here. With a nilometer there and messengers travelling day and night, we could know what to expect while the flood is still far away. This was the way of Egypt, constant refinement of techniques and knowledge, but always within the framework of tradition. New nilometers might be built, but they measured the same eternal cycle that had sustained life in the Nile Valley since before human memory. The nilometer reminds us of an important truth, Ipua continued, his voice taking on the gentle rhythm that indicated deeper wisdom was coming. We cannot control the flood. We cannot command the river to rise exactly 16 cubits, no more, no less. But we can understand it. We can prepare for it. We can work with it rather than against it. He looked at each child in turn, making sure they understood the significance. This is the wisdom of Egypt, passed down since the time of the gods. We do not fight against Mahat, the proper order of things. We find our place within it. The concept of Ma'at was central to Egyptian thought, the idea that the universe had a proper order, a balance and harmony that should be maintained. It governed everything from natural cycles to human behavior, from the movement of stars to the administration of justice. Now, Ipua said, shifting slightly to ease his old bones, who can tell me what happens during Pere, the season we have just entered? The children raised their hands eagerly, each wanting to demonstrate their knowledge. The plants grow, said one of the younger ones. We weed the fields and make sure the irrigation channels work properly, added an older boy. We watch for pests and pray to Osiris for strong crops, contributed another. Ipua nodded at each answer. Yes, all of these things. Pere is the time of growth and care. We have done the hard work of preparing and planting. Now we tend and protect what we have begun. He gestured toward the fields below, where families could be seen moving along the rows of emerging plants, carefully removing weeds and checking irrigation channels. Every day the seedlings grow stronger. Every day they reach higher toward Ra's light. And as they grow, we nurture them just as a mother nurtures her children. The little boy in his lap yawned, the peaceful rhythm of the old man's voice making him drowsy. Ipua smiled and continued, his tone becoming even more gentle and measured. After Pere comes Shemu, the time of harvest. The green plants turn golden under the hot sun. The grain heads become heavy and bend toward the earth. Then the sickles come out and the cutting begins. His hands mimicked the motion of harvesting with a sickle, the curved blade slicing through the stalks, gathering them in bundles. The cut grain is taken to the threshing floor, where oxen walk in circles, their hooves separating the precious kernels from the chaff. Women winnow the grain, tossing it into the air so the breeze can blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back to the mats. These were scenes every Egyptian child knew intimately. Even those who lived in cities or worked at crafts other than farming understood these fundamental processes that sustained all of Egypt. And then, Ipua prompted, the grain goes into storage. Several children answered at once. Yes, into the granaries it goes, some for eating throughout the year, some for trading, some for offerings to the gods, and the most perfect kernels are saved for the next planting. He made a circle with his finger, and so the cycle continues, as it has since Osiris taught us to farm in the time before time. The mention of Osiris led naturally to another favourite topic. "Tell us about the gods of the Nile," requested a girl of about 12. Ipuwer nodded, settling into another well-practiced tale. "The great river is beloved by many gods. Happy is the god of the flood itself, depicted with blue skin and a large belly full of abundance." He patted his own somewhat rounded stomach, making the children giggle. Osiris is connected to the Nile as well, for it was in the river that his body was hidden by his wicked brother Set. When Isis found and restored him, Osiris became the god of vegetation and rebirth, just as the land dies under the flood and is reborn when the waters recede. The old man's voice took on a more solemn tone. "Some say the flood itself is the tears of Isis weeping for her murdered husband. Others say it is the life-giving power of Osiris returning each year to make the land fertile." He looked at the children with twinkling eyes. "Perhaps both are true. The gods work in ways beyond our full understanding." This was typical of Egyptian religious thought. Different, even seemingly contradictory explanations could coexist. What mattered was not rigid theological consistency, but the recognition of divine forces at work in the natural world. "There is another story," Ipuwer continued, "about how the flood began. In the time when gods walked on earth, Egypt was suffering a terrible drought. The people prayed to Ra, the sun god, for relief. Ra took pity on them and commanded his daughter, the fierce goddess Sekhmet, to help. But Sekhmet misunderstood her father's command. Instead of bringing water, she began to slaughter the people of Egypt, drinking their blood in a terrible rampage." The children's eyes widened at this dramatic turn. Even those who had heard the story before leaned forward in anticipation. Ra was horrified. To stop his daughter, he ordered that beer be dyed red to look like blood, and thousands of jugs of this beer were poured out over the fields. Sekhmet, thinking it was blood, drank it all and became so drunk that she fell asleep for 3 days. When she awoke, her rage had passed. She was transformed into the gentler goddess Hathor, and from that day forward, the red-tinged waters of the flood, now understood as the beer that saved humanity, would come each year to nourish the land. The children nodded appreciatively. It was a satisfying explanation for the reddish colour often seen in the first floodwaters, caused by red silt washed down from the Ethiopian highlands. "Are the stories true?" asked a thoughtful boy of about 9. Ipuwer considered the question seriously. "They are true in the way that matters most. They help us understand our place in the world and our relationship with powers greater than ourselves." He looked out at the green fields, the eternal river beyond, and the vast sky above. "The gods speak to us through the rising and falling of the Nile, through the sprouting of seeds and the ripening of grain. Whether we call it Happy or Osiris or simply the flood, the miracle remains the same." The sun was lower now, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Soon mothers would be calling their children home for the evening meal, but there was time for one more story. "Before you go," Ipuwer said, "let me tell you about the very first flood when the world was new." The children settled in, even the drowsy ones perking up for this primordial tale. "In the beginning," the old man intoned, his voice taking on the cadence of the most ancient stories, "there was only Nun, the watery abyss. From Nun rose a mound of earth. the first land, and upon this mound stood Atum, the creator god. His hands shaped an invisible mound in the air. Atum brought forth Shu, the air, and Tefnut, moisture. From them came Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And from Geb and Nut came Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, the gods who would rule the world of humans. When Geb and Nut were separated, earth below and sky above, the space between them became the world we know, and the tears of the gods became the first rainfall which gathered and flowed and became the Nile. The children were quiet now, transported to that mythic time of creation. Each year when the flood comes, Ipua continued softly, it is like the world being created anew. The waters of Nun return, covering the land, and when they recede, fresh earth appears, ready for life to begin again. He smiled at the children, some of whom were now fighting to keep their eyes open in the warm, late afternoon air. This is why we are not afraid of the flood, even though it may sometimes bring hardship. It is part of the creation, part of Ma'at, the right order of things. Without death, there can be no rebirth. Without the flood's destruction, there can be no renewal. The old man fell silent, allowing the children to absorb this final piece of wisdom. Around them, the village was quieting as the workday ended. Families were returning from the fields, preparing evening meals, tending to animals. The eternal rhythms of life continued, as they had for thousands of years along the Nile. One by one, the children were called away by parents or older siblings, each pausing to touch their foreheads to the elder's hand in a gesture of respect before leaving. Soon only the youngest boy remained, still curled in Ipua's lap, now sound asleep. The boy's mother approached, smiling apologetically. "I'm sorry, wise one. Hanenu always falls asleep during your stories." "It is a compliment," Ipua assured her as she gently lifted her son. "Stories should sometimes lead to dreams." Left alone, the old man didn't immediately rise. His bones protested movement after sitting so long, and besides, the view was worth savouring. The green fields stretching to the river, the date palms swaying slightly in the evening breeze, the distant mountains turning purple in the fading light. This was Egypt, his Egypt, the eternal land that had nurtured his ancestors and would nurture generations yet unborn. In his 90 years, Ipua had seen much change. New farming techniques had been introduced, trade had brought exotic goods from distant lands, different pharaohs had ruled, some wisely, others less so, but the essentials remained constant. The Nile still flooded each year, bringing death and rebirth to the land. Farmers still planted and harvested according to the ancient calendar. Children still gathered to hear elders tell the old stories. There was comfort in this continuity, this participation in cycles greater than any individual life. Egyptians did not fear death as some cultures did, for they saw it as merely part of a larger pattern, a transition rather than an ending, just as the land died under the flood only to be reborn. More fertile than before, humans too would experience rebirth if they had lived according to Ma'at and their hearts were found worthy. Ipua finally rose, his joints protesting with familiar aches. He would return to his daughter's home, where he had lived since his wife joined Osiris in the field of reeds 15 years ago. There would be a simple meal, conversation with his grandchildren, perhaps some beer before sleep. Tomorrow would bring another day of tending the growing crops, of maintaining the irrigation systems, of participating in the eternal rhythms of life along the Nile. The flood would come again, and again after that, long after Ipua himself had departed for the afterlife. As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky, the old man made his way slowly down the path toward the village, carrying with him the wisdom of 82 floods, of countless plantings and harvests, of a lifetime spent in harmony with the river that was Egypt's lifeblood. The ancient Egyptians had a saying, "The Nile gives, the Nile takes away, but Egypt endures." In this simple truth lay the essence of their civilization: resilience, adaptation, and faith in the eternal cycles that governed all life. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far removed in time and space from those ancient farmers, perhaps there is wisdom still to be found in their story. They understood something we often forget, that we are part of natural cycles larger than ourselves, that there is a rhythm to life that can't be rushed or controlled, only respected and worked with. The Nile still flows today, though its floods are now controlled by modern dams. The Black Land still produces crops, though tractors have replaced wooden ploughs and oxen. Egypt endures as it has for thousands of years, adapting yet remaining connected to its ancient roots. Perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself there, feeling the rich soil beneath your bare feet, hearing the rustle of papyrus in the gentle breeze, watching the life-giving waters of the Nile flow past, just as they did in the time of the pharaohs. And with that peaceful image, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.